Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Andrew Dalton. I'm the director of the Adams County Historical Society, and I see lots of familiar faces. Really looking forward to this program. We've had so many great evening lectures this year, and we have many more coming up. So before I talk about this evening's program, I just wanted to talk about a few things. Tomorrow, Sunday, the November 12th at 1 o'clock, Tim Smith is giving a free program on John Burns, the hero of Gettysburg, so you can come out to that if you'd like. And then next week, we have a whole host of programs related to the 160th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. On Wednesday, we still have a few tickets left for a luncheon with historian Harold Holzer. He'll be speaking about his career and his many books related to Lincoln and Gettysburg. Then the following day, Thursday, the 16th next week, we're doing a program here with Gary Edelman and Tim Smith called Lincoln at Gettysburg, 25 Hours That Changed History. And that'll be a walkthrough of the Lincoln's timeline, 25 hours, not 24 hours, according to Tim. So that is, you'll learn about every hour and where he was walking at what time. And then on Friday at 7 p.m. we have an event that's limited to just a few people, just because of the space in the gallery, but it's called An Evening with William A. Frassanito, and he will walk people through his exhibit featuring his collection in our changing gallery downstairs on the first floor. And then finally on Saturday, at 2 p.m., we're screening a film called Budapest to Gettysburg by local filmmaker Jake Borrett about his father's illustrious career. Gabor Borrett, a former professor at Gettysburg College and founder of the Civil War Institute, or one of the founders of the Civil War Institute. So that'll be 2 o'clock on Saturday. Tickets for all those things are available on our website. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers this evening. I'm looking forward to the program, and I see many of you already picked up a copy of the book, Serpents of War, An American Officer's Story of World War I Combat and Captivity. We just found our extra supply, so if you're still looking for one, we found the ones in the back, and they're now out. So very popular already this evening. So our two guests, I know one of them very well, and the other I just met earlier this evening. Really looking forward to hearing their story. Stephen Trout is a professor of English at the University of Alabama and the author of 3 books, including On the Battlefield of Memory, The First World War and American Remembrance, 1919 to 1941. And also my good friend Ian Isherwood is here. He's the Associate Professor of War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College and the author of Remembering the Great War, Writing and Publishing the Experiences of World War I. Ian also served as an advisor to our Museum Development Committee to help put together Beyond the Battle, which I'm sure many of you have had a chance to see downstairs. So I hope you'll check out the book, and I'm really looking forward to this talk this evening. So thank you both for being here.
All right, this one's live? Okay, great. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday night on a holiday weekend to hear a talk about World War I. I'm so happy to be here with my colleague Steve Trout to talk about the book in which we just edited and published this year, Serpents of War, and talk to you about Harry Dravo Parkin. Thank you, Andrew, for suggesting that we come and do this event, and thank you to all your colleagues at the Historical Society for having us here. Since it's Veterans Day, I wanted to just say, for those of you who served in uniform who are here, thank you. We very much, of course, appreciate not only your service, but also for keeping our nation safe. So thank you very much. The holiday of Veterans Day, of course, comes from, as you all know, from World War I, from the ending of the war on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And so we thought it was appropriate to have our talk this weekend and to talk about someone who served during that war and was actually at the time of the armistice in a German hospital as a wounded American officer who was a prisoner of war. And then later on would end up being repatriated and brought back. So we're going to talk a bit about his journey as an officer, his journey in the First World War, what got him from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to the Meuse-Argonne, and then got him into Germany and then repatriated back to the United States. We're going to talk a bit about the historical journey of Harry Parkin, and then we're going to talk in the second half of the presentation about how how we edited this book. So how we actually put together, took a war memoir that was originally in 5 volumes and condensed it down, annotated it, and put it into 1 volume. So we'll be splitting our time. I'll talk a little bit about the history, and then my colleague Steve will talk about the writing side and the literary side of Harry Parkin's memoir. For those of you who haven't checked out the book, I will say this is the type of book you can judge by its cover. It has a beautiful cover, Serpents of War. So it not only is a very attractive, very good-looking book, it's also a very affordable book. So if you're interested in buying it, there are copies for sale downstairs, and we'd be happy to sign those afterward. So I'm going to begin with a kind of a short story. When I started my career as a historian, I was finishing up my dissertation in Musselman Library at Gettysburg College, where I was working as an adjunct. And my dissertation was on war memoirs of the First World War. And the college has a large collection of somewhere around 300 first editions of World War I memoirs. It's a beautiful collection of books. And what's really interesting is that in the front plate of all of those books is a book plate that is right up there on the screen. It's a book plate that says, "In memory of Harry Dravo Parkin, 1880 to 1946, Major 316th Infantry, 79th Division, AEF, World War I." It then has the insignia of his Distinguished Service Cross, which he was awarded after the war, and it says, "A gift of his widow, Alice Dangerfield Parkin." So way back then, well over 10 years ago, as I'm finishing up my doctorate, I was intrigued by this fellow, Harry Parkin. And I was extra intrigued when I was told by people working in special collections that they not only had all of these books that Parkin had collected, World War I memoirs, but they also had a World War I memoir that Harry Parkin had written about his service. One that was unpublished, but was bound in 5 volumes and upstairs in the archive of Gettysburg College. So shortly after I finished my doctorate, I went upstairs and I had a look at this manuscript, and I thought, it's a pretty great manuscript. The guy can write. Because it's in 5 volumes, though, it's way too long, right? And so I had to look through it, and then when my colleague Steve Trout visited Gettysburg College to give a talk in 2018, Steve had a look at the manuscript too, and the two of us, and we'll talk a little bit later about this process, but the two of us thought maybe this work would be a good work to actually release to the wider public. Maybe this memoir has some value. All memoirs do, of course, but maybe this one has value for a wider audience. So that's my connection with Harry Parkin. It begins with a book plate in a library, and it ends now with a published book with a very attractive cover that is affordable and available for purchase downstairs. So where do we begin? Well, we begin with Harry Parkin. Who is this Harry Parkin person, and what is his story? So there is Harry Parkin. That's a picture of him taken after the First World War. He's wearing his helmet. He's wearing his fur-lined officer's overcoat, which he mentioned several times in his memoir. And that's actually his house, the house that Harry Parkin lived in with his wife Alice and with their young son, Harry Jr., in Pittsburgh. Harry Parkin was born in Pittsburgh. He was the son of a man who made a fortune in steel. He married a woman who also came from a well-to-do family, and the two of them settled in Pittsburgh in Shadyside, which is a very, very nice neighborhood in the kind of outside of the center city of Pittsburgh, but they settled in Shadyside on a very leafy street with a very nice house. Harry Parkin went to Shadyside Academy, so he went to a private school in Pittsburgh, and then he went to Harvard, where he graduated in the class of 1904. While he was at Harvard, he decided he wanted to study the law, but he didn't finish his law degree. Instead, he came back to Pittsburgh and ended up working for his father in steel. And that's where he settled down, got married, and ended up having his son, Harry Jr. One of the interesting parts of kind of Harry Parkin's life, and something for us to consider, is he's very similar to a lot of other officers in the American Expeditionary Force, in that he came from an upper middle class family. He had some degree of private education. He went to a very, very good college, came back, kind of worked in business, but kind of came from the upper crust of Pittsburgh life. And that definitely comes across within his memoir, the way in which he talks about his soldiers, the way in which he talks about other fellow officers. They're very, very kind of a clubby sort of kind of interconnected group of people. So Harry Parkin ends up settling in Pittsburgh. The First World War breaks out in 1914. The U.S., of course, is not involved in the First World War yet. But there's a movement that takes place in the United States that by 1916 has gained some traction. And some of you undoubtedly have heard about this movement. It's called the Preparedness Movement. And what this movement was, is it was a movement by politicians, so people like former President Theodore Roosevelt, and by Leonard Wood, who was the former Chief of Staff of the Army, right, to kind of prepare young men to go off to war if the United States actually intervenes. And what the preparedness movement does is they raise a lot of money and they create camps kind of all over the Northeast, but the most prominent one is in a place called Plattsburgh, New York. And they create these training camps to privately train men to then later get commissions in the U.S. Army if the U.S. Army intervenes in the First World War. And in 1916, Harry Parkin goes off to Plattsburgh, and in the summer of 1916, he's engaged in drill and digging trenches, and he's learning how to command men. He's in Plattsburgh with a number of other officers that he will later serve with in the First World War. Well, that's 1916. The United States is not yet involved in the war, but Harry Parkin is very much one of these people that is thinking about U.S. intervention in the First World War, which will come in April of 1917. And it's in April 1917 that Harry Parkin decides to volunteer. He goes up to Fort Niagara, where he joins a number of other Pittsburgh men that he undoubtedly knew from social circles in Pittsburgh, where he joined them in an officer's training school at Fort Niagara. And let me see if I can get the pointer to work, Andrew. That's Harry Parkin right there. This fellow right here is a fellow captain of his in the 79th Division, Du P, and he will publish a memoir called A Machine Gunner in France. Harry Parkin is right there in that newspaper clipping of Pittsburgh men at Fort Niagara. And it's at Fort Niagara he's commissioned an officer. It's where he ends up training as an officer, and then he ends up becoming a captain when he arrives at Fort Meade, Maryland in August of 1917. So he comes down to Fort Meade, Maryland, and the photo right here, there's Harry Parkin, there's his wife, Alice Dangerfield, and that is his young son, Harry Jr. And you'll notice something actually really interesting about Harry Jr. He's wearing a miniature version of his father's uniform with officer boots and with tiny little captain's insignia that are there on his uniform. This is a house that the Parkins rented at Roland Park outside of Baltimore, and he would commute every day into Fort Meade, where he was in command of a company. So at Fort Meade, he becomes part of the 316th Infantry, which is part of the 79th Division, that will eventually go over to the Western Front the following summer in 1918. A couple things to consider about the 79th Division. So this division is mostly recruiting soldiers who are draftees from Pennsylvania and from Maryland. And there's a good number of kind of local soldiers from Adams County and central Pennsylvania that actually end up in the 316th. They end up training in Fort Meade outside of Baltimore. Most of the training that they received is just trying to get kind of citizen soldiers citizens and turn them into soldiers. So it's like basic kind of boot camp, but introduction to military life, how to wear your uniform, how to march, right? How to actually use your weapon. So it's that kind of training of trying to get kind of a mob of draftees and to make them into military units. And this is important later to Harry Parkin's story. They end up training at Fort Meade for almost a year, and then they go over to France. in 1918, summer of 1918, where they then go into training with the French Army. And they're in training for a very brief period with the French Army. Before then, they end up being deployed north of Verdun. And they didn't know exactly where they were going or what they were going to be doing, but they will be a part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which is about to begin at the end of September of 1918. So here's a couple interesting pictures. So the black and white pictures that are in the presentation are from Harry Parkin's scrapbook, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Any of the contemporary photos you see are pictures that I took this summer. So what we see here is, this is a position in the Meuse-Argonne. This is called Montfaucon. It's a position that the 79th Division was charged with taking on the 26th of September, 1918. And at the top of it, at the top of this hill, there's a ruined abbey that's there. There was also a big German observation post that was there. So Montfaucon is a hill, but it's a very prominent hill that then is able to command the landscape underneath it. So it's a very important position for the German army to hold, right? And that means it's a very important position for the German army to defend, and defend in depth in case if the Americans are going to attack it. So when Parkin's men end up coming over and training and then going into battle at the Meuse-Argonne, and I'm just going to pull up my graphic here from the American Battle Monuments Commission, which is a cool map that shows you something of what the Meuse-Argonne looks like. So the sector that we see that has all of the shading and lines on it, so that's the Meuse-Argonne. That's where the Meuse-Argonne offensive is going to take place. It is north of the fortified French city of Verdun, which undoubtedly you've heard of the Battle of Verdun. So it's north of that, but it's this huge sector in which the American Army, the American First Army, is going to batter against German trench lines and fortifications, batter this position from the 26th of September through the armistice. And the American Expeditionary Force is going to advance first from south to north and then start to advance east. And literally going from position to position, from hill to hill, from trench line to trench line, as they're trying to batter their way forward. If we go a bit narrower on the map, we see some interesting graphics here. So right there is where the 79th Division is going to fight, where Harry Parkin's going to fight. And you'll notice it's right in the middle of the starting off point of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The red line here is the American trench line where they begin their assault from, and then up here is Montfaucon, so that is the position in which his regiment is tasked with taking. So there are two regiments that are going to advance in the lead at kind of the point of the spear, and then there are two regiments that are going to advance behind them. And the regiment in front of Harry Parkin's is the 313th Infantry. They're going to be tasked with taking Montfaucon up here on the left, and behind them is Harry Parkin's 316th Infantry, right? So what happens on the 26th of September is that the 313th is supposed to take this position, and they fail in taking that position. There's a number of reasons for this. We can talk about this in the Q&A if you'd like. But they end up failing to take the position in the first day. And why this is kind of a big deal is because if you see this pink line here, the AEF is basically supposed to be one kind of line here of units that have advanced to a particular place at a particular timetable at the end of the first day. And what you'll see here is that the 79th Division is holding up the rest of that kind of progress of the AEF, right? The next day, on the 27th, the 313th Infantry will take Montfaucon. They'll take it in the morning. They're then backed up by the 316th Infantry, but the 313th takes such high casualties that they have to be kind of pulled out of the line. And so this means that Harry Parkin's unit on the 27th is going to take over as the point of the spear of the 79th Division. And for the next few days, they're going to batter their way forward batter their way forward, literally from machine gun position to machine gun position, from small wood to small wood, to be able to batter their way forward and to fight their way forward until they are eventually pulled out of the line on the 1st of October, after suffering pretty severe casualties. So the 79th Division overall suffers pretty terrible casualties in the fighting of their first battle. Now, part of the reason that this is interesting to go into in depth for us is because when Harry Parkin's unit is pulled out of the line, they end up coming under stigma. They end up getting kind of a reprimand from senior officers to them because they didn't take Montfaucon on the first day, and they kind of let down the AEF's timetable. And this is a huge surprise to Harry Parkin, and he writes about this within the book, because he thinks that his unit fights valiantly. He thinks that they fight well and heroically, and that they've accomplished an awful lot, not just militarily, but in terms of personal endurance in what they've actually been through. So the division comes under some degree of stigma, and that's part of the story of Harry Parkin within this book. Harry Parkin's war doesn't end in the attack on Montfaucon. It continues after that. His unit's pulled out of the line, and they go into some additional training. They basically go into trench duty, kind of lighter trench duty in a quiet sector. But at the end of the war, the very end of the war, they are tasked with taking another position. And this is Hill 378, known as Corn Willie Hill. And on the 4th of November, Harry Parkin will lead his battalion of the 316th Infantry to attack that hill. The contemporary photo that you see, the color photo, is from the top of the hill looking down. This is from kind of the valley looking up. So they're tasked with taking another fortified hill. And it's on the 4th of November that Harry Parkin's unit is going to attack this position. They're going to take their objective at the top of the hill. But then they're going to suffer a counterattack by German soldiers. And in the process of the counterattack, Harry Parkin leads his men in a desperate bayonet charge to be able to hold that position. Over the course of the day, though, the German army starts battering them with artillery fire. And they then send another larger counterattack that ends up leaving Harry Parkin severely wounded, along with a lot of other officers and men, on top of the hill, and then leads to him going into captivity. Interestingly enough, he takes multiple wounds to both of his legs, and he still commands his men from his trench. He's not incapacitated by it. He's still in command when he then ends up being captured and taken captive. His story from there, and this is what I think separates his memoir from a lot of other ones. There's not a ton of World War I memoirs that are written by what I would consider kind of mid-grade officers, so by majors or battalion commanders, and so it's kind of an interesting memoir just from that perspective. But it's extra interesting, I think, because he's a prisoner of war, and he's a prisoner of war that's taken captive at the very end of the war, which means that when he ends up being placed on a German stretcher and he ends up being taken to a German ambulance and then to a train depot, what he's witnessing around him is an exhausted German army that's at the end of its tether, right? And he's then being taken kind of eastward, and he's witnessing kind of the desperation of the end of the war in Germany. And that makes it actually a really interesting book about his observations about what that actually looks like. Of course, he's not a captive for very long. The war will end a week after Harry Parkin is wounded, which makes him a very unlucky officer, I think, too. But he ends up surviving, which makes him very lucky at the same time. And he gets pretty good treatment from his German doctors. Before then, he's repatriated and brought back into France and eventually to a hospital in Paris, where he will receive medical treatment in his hospital in Paris, and then eventually come home. Harry Parkin's war doesn't necessarily end with the armistice, though. And I just want to bring up a couple of other points about things that we can extract from his memoir, things we can extract that I think are really valuable observations that he gives us. The first thing is that Parkin tells us an awful lot about the experience of war, in particular of an American Expeditionary Force officer. So he has a lot of temporal details, and he has a really good eye for detail as well, and he writes very well. He also is a very opinionated officer. He has very strong feelings about some of the officers that he serves with, has very strong feelings about the way in which the AEF's fighting on the Western Front. So he tells us a lot about the experience of war. He also tells us, of course, something about the experience of captivity and his observations about the German army there, too. Another aspect of his memoir that's common to kind of all war memoirs, but really comes across, is that this war memoir also is a tribute to the men and the officers in which he's fighting with. He brings up a lot of officers. He describes their personalities. He talks about some of the men that he serves with. But in many ways, he's paying tribute to a number of his comrades that he serves with, one of whom, who's killed near him in the course of the war, is a man who's under him, Dan Keller here, and he features prominently within the memoir, and he's paid tribute to by Harry Parkin. Another fellow officer, Major William Sinclair Manning, he was the son of the governor of South Carolina and becomes a good friend of Parkin in the 79th Division. The two men will command in different battalions, but Manning is killed, and his body is brought back to Arlington Cemetery, where he's buried, and none other than John Pershing is actually at his funeral. And so Parkin pays tribute to Manning as well. And this fellow here, that's his battalion surgeon, Dr. Cornwall, who also is presented. He lives through the war. He's also memorialized, though, and talked about in a very favorable light over the course of the memoir. So it's a really interesting memoir, if you'll pardon the pun. It's a captivating memoir of a person's service in the First World War. Parkin makes it back to the United States. He ends up moving to California, where he gets involved in real estate speculation, and it's at that time that he starts collecting more war memorabilia, more war books, and then at some point, we think in the 1920s, he sits down to write his memoir. I just wanted to give a quick introduction to my colleague, Steve Trout. My colleague, Steve Trout, is going to come up now, and he's going to talk about the process of us actually putting together and editing this book. Steve Trout's from the University of Alabama, and one of the things that I really like about our partnership on this is that Steve has a PhD in literature, in English literature, but specializes in war writing in particular. I'm a historian who likes to pretend that he knows something about literature, and so we made a really good kind of team as we went through and started to look at this. So without further ado, Steve Trout.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. Can you hear me okay? So Ian has given you a wonderful overview of who Harry Dravo Parkin was and what kind of experience he had in the First World War, and also given you a sense, I think, of this battle that Harry Dravo Parkin participated in twice. As many of you in this room know, the Meuse-Argonne offensive from September 26, 1918 to November 11th was the bloodiest battle in American history. It was far more lethal than any battle you can name that Americans fought in the Second World War. About half the number of Americans who died in the entire American war in Vietnam died at the Meuse-Argonne. More Americans died at the Meuse-Argonne in the fall of 1918 than died in Ulysses S. Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864. And that, as many of you know, was a campaign that was so bloody it nearly cost Lincoln the election. So this is, I think, a very important perspective that Parkin brings to this event, and I was just pleased to work with Ian to bring it into print. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we did that and what the process was that we followed to edit this memoir. So when we started, we have a book that's in 5 volumes over in the Musselman Library. okay, each one bearing that wonderful book plate that Ian showed you. We think there were multiple copies of this set in existence because one of the great things that Ian did when we were working on this project was he tracked down Harry Dravo Parkin's grandson, Pete Parkin. And this was really important for a number of reasons that I'll mention in a moment. But Pete Parkin was able to tell us that he actually had in his possession a set that appeared to be identical to this. We didn't have an opportunity to actually compare the two, which would have been interesting, but it's quite likely, given the affluence of the Parkin family, that they had multiple sets of this memoir produced and probably passed them out to friends and family members. When did Parkin write the memoir? Well, Ian and I are convinced that he wrote it in the 1920s, and he may have even started writing it as soon as 1919 or 1920. There are a couple of very specific pieces of evidence that point to that maybe Ian can mention in the Q&A. But one thing stands out from the start. There's no mention of the Great Depression. There's no mention of the rise of fascism in Europe. There's no mention of anything really beyond the early 1920s. Another reason, again, beyond some others we can talk about in the Q&A, why we're pretty certain that he wrote it very soon after the war, is he indicates in several places that his main reason for writing the memoir was to give his son, Harry Parkin Jr., a sense of what his father went through. And he refers to his son as a boy in the narrative. So this again suggests to us that this was something that Parkin put together when the experience was relatively fresh. So how do you get from this book over in the Musselman Library contained in 5 volumes to this beautiful book published by the University Press of Kansas, available downstairs for purchase? How does that happen? You really have 2 options. First, you can scan that original document because it doesn't exist electronically. Okay, it's only in paper form. You can scan it, and that will give you a version of it in Microsoft Word that then you can edit and manipulate. Okay, but there's a problem with this. If you, even using the scanning technology in 2023, which is much better than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago, some of you may have had some experience with this, that scanning technology will introduce dozens and dozens and dozens of anomalous errors. Q's will turn into P's, L's will turn into the number 1, on and on and on and on and on. And we just didn't want to go through that. The second option is you hire a typist to recopy the whole thing. And we were able to do that in a very interesting and surprising way. So after I looked at this memoir when I was here in 2018, Amy Lukadama was nice enough to scan some pages and send them to me. And I agreed with Ian that it was worthy of publication. I wanted to work with him to bring it back into print. After that, we thought about the press that we wanted to work with, and we selected the University Press of Kansas, which is a very distinguished publisher of military history in the United States, arguably the most prestigious within the United States. And I had worked with the editor there, Joyce Harrison, on a number of projects. And so we sent an excerpt to Joyce. It was a section describing Major Parkin's captivity, actually, when he was taken into Germany after he was captured on November 4th. And she looked it over, liked what she saw, and then she sent it out to 2 World War I experts to review the manuscript and to weigh in on whether they thought it was valuable or not. And they liked it. And so then we told Joyce the problem we were going to face in terms of turning this into an electronic document that we could manipulate. And Joyce Harrison, our esteemed editor at the University Press of Kansas, then disclosed that she had had a long career prior to becoming a University Press editor as a typist, and was quick to brag about how many words she could do a minute. And so we said, well, I wonder if we could hire you as a freelancer then. And that's exactly what we did. So this is probably the only time this will ever happen in the history of academic publishing in the United States of America, that our editor at a prestigious press wound up typing the book that we published with that press. But that is exactly what happened. So she went ahead and faithfully transcribed the entire memoir, and then we had a document that we could edit, that we could annotate, that we could alter if we needed to, that we could work on. So that was the first challenge. The second challenge was presented by the document itself. it was nearly 200,000 words long. Had we published the entire memoir, we would be looking at a book probably well over 600 pages that would easily be an additional inch or so in width, okay, when compared with the book that you actually see tonight. And in the view of the University Press of Kansas, and I think rightly so, this made the book really unpublishable, because most university presses are strapped. It's hard for them to come up with the resources they need to publish valuable academic titles. And so if they had published the 200,000 word version of this book, it probably would have retailed for something like $89.99. Now, don't misunderstand me here. Ian and I will never see any royalties from this book in our lifetime. The author of the book is long gone, too late to help him. Editors on projects like this don't typically earn anything. So that wasn't the concern. The concern was that if the book retailed for $89.99, no university library or college library would be able to afford to purchase it. This is something that we're seeing in higher education that is a matter of great concern. In book-driven disciplines like mine, like English, or like Ian's in history, fewer and fewer colleges and universities can actually purchase books regularly to keep them in their libraries. They're just becoming too expensive. And then also we wanted individual researchers, we wanted World War I enthusiasts, people who are fascinated by war memoirs, by the experiences of Americans in the AEF to be able to purchase the book. And last but not least, we wanted people who might have a family connection to the 79th Division and to the Meuse-Argonne, and perhaps even to the 1st Battalion of the 316th Infantry to be able to get their hands on this book. So we had an enormous challenge. In some respects, though, Harry Dravo Parkin made it easy for us. He was a gifted writer, a fabulous eye for detail, as Ian indicated. But for whatever reason, he seemed to lose track as he worked on this memoir of what he had already written. And so he would sometimes repeat the same anecdote over and over, or he would introduce a particular soldier with a paragraph of information and then do it all over again. And I think part of the problem was he was juggling these multiple volumes. There must have been some plan he was working from in the beginning that broke this thing up into these 5 separate books, and he lost track of what he was doing. He struggled with alcohol, and this may also have been a factor here. We know from Pete Parkin, who has vivid memories of his grandfather, that Harry Dravo Parkin suffered from profound survivor's guilt. In many, many respects, he was proud of his service. He collected military artifacts from the time he was probably 9 or 10 years old. Pete Parkin remembered that his grandfather's den was filled with Napoleonic memorabilia and with all kinds of antique weapons and pieces of armor and whatnot. And when he came back from France in 1919, Harry Dravo Parkin put his Distinguished Service Cross right up there with all of those Napoleonic decorations, along with his sidearm and his other decorations. So this is a man who was fiercely proud of his military service, but he had demons that he had to deal with as well. And I think he felt profoundly the loss of so many men around him in the Meuse-Argonne. You have to understand that when Parkin's battalion comes out of its first 6 days of battle at the start of this and doesn't achieve that objective, as Ian was mentioning, Parkin can only account for about 1/4 of the 1,000 soldiers under his command. Now, some of those guys are dead, some of them are wounded, some of them are driven out of their minds, they're shell-shocked, they're not able to function. Some of them are just scared to death, and they run off and hide, and then when the unit comes out of the line, they come back, and typically their explanation is, I got separated from the unit, which meant essentially that when the bullets started flying and the shells, they just were not going to be part of that. One of the problems with the 79th Division was that these soldiers had never heard a shot fired in anger before they were sent to take that objective at the top of that hill. And so they had no combat experience. They had no idea what to expect. They were poorly trained for all kinds of reasons. They just were the worst possible troops, probably in many respects, to be given this particular assignment. wasn't that they weren't eager, it wasn't that they weren't brave, it wasn't that they didn't want to serve their country and distinguish themselves, but they had no experience with this. And when you read about the Meuse-Argonne, you quickly realize that John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, had impossible expectations for the soldiers under his command. You know, the French had been trying to take many of these positions for years, losing thousands and thousands of soldiers, and Pershing assumed that since Americans had not been tainted by the experience of trench warfare, they would just be able to take them in a matter of days, you know, and he was tragically wrong about that. So Parkin, for whatever reason, had problems, I think, composing his memoir. It's sometimes repetitious. The war trauma he suffered, his issues with alcohol, he self-medicated with scotch, he was a very heavy drinker, particularly toward the end of his life. All of these things may have contributed to this. So we started cutting out the passages where he repeats himself. We also cut out some digressions which we found fascinating and were loath to cut, and which maybe 2 other World War I experts in the world really wish they could read. And these were places where Harry Dravo Parkin would talk about, for example, the strengths and weaknesses of various machine guns used by all of the combatant armies in a section of, say, 50 pages. That had to go. Or the section where he talks about the articles of the doughboy's clothing. Let's talk about the merits of leather leggings versus wool wrap puttees. That's a good 15 pages. Let's talk about the overseas cap versus the campaign hat. Let's talk about the quality of wool used in the overcoat versus the tunic, and on and on and on. These things are fascinating if you are a total World War I geek, as Ian and I are. Not so much, probably, if you want to pick the book up to get a sense of soldiers' experience. So we had to do quite a bit of trimming. And in the end, the book that we published is about 138,000 words. So that will give you some idea. It took us about 3 years to work on this, to edit the text, to write the introduction, to create the critical apparatus. One other thing we had to do, I forgot to mention this at the college yesterday, Parkin's chapter organization was eccentric to say the least. So he would have one chapter that would run for maybe 80 pages, followed by another chapter that would be 20. And so we wanted to iron this out so this wouldn't interfere with the readability. But once we started breaking some of those long chapters up, we realized we had to come up with new chapter titles. So some of the chapter titles are Parkin's, some of them are ours, which makes the book a kind of collaboration in a very real way, I think. So that will give you some idea of the difficulty we faced in terms of actually working with the text. The next challenge we faced was where were we going to get the illustrations for this book? And we didn't want to use the U.S. Army Signal Corps images that you see over and over and over again in any book about America in World War I. We wanted things specific to Harry Dravo Parkin's experience and to the 79th Division and the attack on Montfaucon. When Ian contacted Pete Parkin, we learned that Pete had a scrapbook that contained photographs of the people and places mentioned in his grandfather's memoir. And I don't know what Ian said to Pete Parkin. Ian, I suspect, can be very persuasive and charming, but he got Pete Parkin to mail this family scrapbook to him so that we could actually use it and scan the images and include them in the book. So if you look through the book, you'll see that the photographs in there are almost all credited as coming from the scrapbook of Harry Dravo Parkin. There are a few generic U.S. Army Signal Corps images in there, but they were the ones that Parkin picked for his scrapbook, so I think they have extra significance. There's a problem, though. The photographs were in horrible condition. So we had the images, but we couldn't imagine that many of them would be workable. And this is where we were helped out by our good friend, Amy Lucadamo, from the Musselman Library, who it turned out was an expert in how to clean up photographic images. And so one thing that Ian and I deeply regret about this presentation is we didn't include a before and after so that you could see one of the images in the book the way that it looked before Amy went to work on it. But she was able to clean these up, and you can see when you look at them in the book that some of them, obviously that scrapbook was kept in an attic. These photographs were baked for decades or maybe kept down in a damp basement, but they look pretty good considering where they started, okay? Then the final thing that we had to deal with in bringing this memoir back into print. We knew that readers in 2023, and from this point forward, are going to need some extra information about the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, about this major battle that Parkin was in, about the military organization that he was part of. So we attacked that in two ways. We wrote a fairly detailed introduction that goes through most of the content that Ian included in his presentation. And then my good friend Ian annotated this entire memoir, all 138,000 words of it, so that when Parkin mentions a fellow officer, Ian's got a footnote, and you can learn that Parkin met that officer at the Plattsburgh training camp. And you learn something about the social background of the men that Parkin served with. This is all important. It's not trivial, because it all contributes to the picture that you get of Harry Dravo Parkin as this Pittsburgh blue blood who was surrounded by other officers who came from a similar social background, very different from the working class men they commanded. Most of those working class men, by the way, came from this part of the country. They came from throughout central Pennsylvania and from around Baltimore and the DC area. This is one of the reasons, presumably, why the Parkin account wound up at Gettysburg College here. Okay, so those details are important in and of themselves, but I think they're important because collectively they give you a picture of the way that the AEF in World War I was socially stratified and what were the backgrounds of people at different levels, and you get a sense of that. And so another wonderful thing I think about Ian's work on the annotations is he didn't overdo it. You've all had the experience of reading books where the editors have been too diligent and every passing reference has a note. Personally, my pet peeve is when they put them all at the end rather than at the bottom of the page, and then you're going nuts flipping back and forth trying to find them. Penguin Books does this. They've been doing it since Penguin Books was created. We need to collectively complain. But if you look at what we did here, we put them at the bottom of the page so that you can find that detail quickly. Okay? So that's some information about how we edited it, how we found the illustrations, the editorial work that we put into it. We'd like to close this presentation, if you like. I can stop here, but if you'd like, I'll read a couple passages from the memoir to give you a sense of the flavor of it. Would that be okay? Okay. So the first one I'm going to read to you describes a magical moment in the text. And it's the moment when Harry Dravo Parkin reaches France. And this, as you'll see, is an extraordinary point in the narrative. Bear in mind, too, it took weeks for these transports carrying American soldiers to France to cross the Atlantic, because they couldn't do it in a straight line because of the U-boats. So they're zigzagging like crazy, filled with seasick soldiers, okay, many of whom have never seen the ocean before. So it was an ordeal to get to France. The ship that carried Harry Dravo Parkin and most of the 1st Battalion of the 316th Infantry was called the Agamemnon. But that was not its original name. It was a German liner that had been seized in port when America went to war in April 1917. And so there's a great irony here that you have a German liner renamed the Agamemnon, used to carry American doughboys to fight Germany. Parkin hated the ship because it was extremely uncomfortable. July 18, 1918 was a great day in the history of the regiment, for it was on that date that we finally ended our weary and crowded sea voyage and came to the shores of beautiful France. After making out land low and dim on the horizon, when first we came on deck, we watched it grow clearer and nearer as the hours passed. For probably 95% of us, this was the first view of the old world from which our ancestors came to the new world, now so far behind us. Could we have known what fate held in store for us in that land ahead, we would have approached it in a more serious mood. But we knew not, and we were weary of the long voyage and happy to see France, upon which the bright sun shone, bringing out the tall white cliffs, topped by the clean green fields, with here and there a fresh white house, with a pretty red roof. High above the tops of the tall cliffs floated a huge sausage balloon. What purpose an observation balloon could fulfill there on the coast, except to see and herald the approach of ships and convoys, we could not understand, and concluded that was the reason for its presence. The entrance to the harbor of Brest, for that was our port of debarkation, is narrow, exceptionally so. As we slowly steamed in, we met the monster transport, the Leviathan, majestically passing out to sea. She had left New York the day before we sailed, had crossed, unloaded, reloaded, and was now on her return voyage. Our ship was big, 20,000 tons, but when we came abreast of her, she towered above us like a high steel cliff. And now occurred one of those rare and soul-lifting incidents of the war, a moment one never forgets nor ever loses the thrill of. Crowding her rails there above us were hundreds of wounded soldiers, their heads and limbs swathed in white bandages. A tremendous roar roared up from our crowded deck, and thousands of hats waved frantically. Faintly down to us came an answering cheer, and crutches and caps were waved along the rails of the great ship. Back to them went another cheer, officers, soldiers, sailors, every one at the top of their voices, and they had passed on their way home. The harbor of Brest did not seem large, but it was closely landlocked and a fine, safe anchorage for ships with which it was crowded. Warships, destroyers, transports, and harbor craft, through which we slowly steamed, seemed to fill it almost to capacity. Rising above the harbor on all sides and tier on tier was the old city of Brest, picturesque and strange to us. Many great buildings of gray stone, some of them no doubt hundreds of years old. But we had very little time to admire this fine old city, for we were to disembark at once. When we had tied up to our buoy, a landing stage was attached to us, alongside of which a light steamer soon appeared, on which we were to go ashore. A very steep gangplank without handrails was set up to a door in one of our lower decks. It was so steep that it was very difficult to negotiate, especially so for soldiers heavily loaded with full packs, rifles, and equipment. Some of the men lost their balance and reached the foot of the gangplank in a clattering mess of self, rifle, and equipment. It became necessary to station soldiers on the landing stage to prevent some of them from sliding off into the water. One small soldier, entrusted with a package of Victrola records, lost his footing about halfway down and simply plunged the rest of the way, his rifle and records flung wide, but fortunately landing on the landing stage. And strange to say, none of the records was broken, to the delight of his comrades, who had let out a groan when they saw them flying through the air. They would have been impossible to replace in France, and the soldiers greatly valued them. I came down the gangplank very gingerly, placing each foot sideways and carefully on the cleats, and reached the bottom safely, but convinced that it was a mighty poor way to take men off a ship. My second passage is a little briefer, and it comes from that period when the 316th Infantry is in support of the 313th. Okay, the 313th was leading the attack on Montfaucon. The 316th was following behind them. That in no way meant that Harry Dravo Parkin soldiers were safe, because the Germans were using defense in depth. And so the soldiers in the lead position would often go right past camouflaged machine gun positions that wouldn't start firing on American soldiers until they could hit them in the back or catch them in a crossfire. And then, of course, long-range German artillery is hitting everybody, the soldiers in support as well as those in the front. And so here's a section, brief section, that describes an incident during Harry Dravo Parkin's support of the 313th Infantry. He gives an anecdote, and then he reflects on German snipers. At another halt, my staff and I had an experience which seems rather funny now, but did not then. A German sniper in a tree, and there were many of these left behind by the Germans, had fired some bullets very close to us as we sat on the ground. So we moved into a small shell hole, which was not large enough for the four of us, myself, Lieutenant Keller, Lieutenant Foraker, and Sergeant Major McCormick. This sniper was a pretty good shot, and he fired very close every time one of us moved. We were most uncomfortable and getting fairly mad about it. You hear that patrician inflection in Parkin's voice there. It's very close to British understatement, okay? So you can definitely hear his class and educational background there. Getting fairly mad about it. No one seemed much afraid. When I saw the advance begin again, I knew we must get up and go on, and I feared this meant the death of one of us. So I thought out a plan. I gave each a direction to run in at the count of 3. I counted, we all sprang up together and ran in different directions. The German sniper was so confused at so many targets, all going in different directions, that he didn't fire a shot, and we all got away. About German snipers, I would like to include here a few lines. We always regarded it as a mean, contemptible way to wage war. It was more like real murder than war. Snipers never stopped in advance nor won a battle, and hence are in reality useless in winning a war. I've always thought it took a mean, sneaking man to make a sniper. Our men hated them and killed them ruthlessly like dogs. But it must take great courage to remain behind after your army is driven back and keep on killing men in the midst of your enemy, knowing that you have but the slightest chance to escape death, as you are bound to be discovered sooner or later. I'd like to close with some thank yous. This is what the memoir looks like. There's the first page, and to add to the complexity of this editing process, we found an errata bound within one of the volumes that lists errors that were detected by a fellow officer who served with Harry Dravo Parkin in the 1st Battalion, but we haven't been able to identify who it was. And so Ian, because the historical annotations were his responsibility, he had to check every single one of these. And those that were in fact errors, we altered or noted accordingly. So we have a number of people to thank. This would have been impossible without Pete Parkin, Harry Dravo Parkin's grandson, who was enthusiastic about this project and supportive of it from the beginning. Joyce Harrison, our wonderful editor and typist at the University Press of Kansas, and Bill Walker, great historian of the 79th Division, who was also very supportive of it. I want to thank Andrew Dalton for inviting us here tonight. Thank all of you for coming in this extraordinary facility. This is the most beautiful county historical society I will ever speak in. I think that's for certain. I want to thank Amy Lucadamo again, featured here next to Ian on the Parkapalooza in France last summer, for her help with the 5-volume set and the photographs and so much more. And the provost at Gettysburg College, who put me up in the beautiful Gettysburg Hotel here for a few nights. And then my own department chair back at the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, Professor David Deutsch, and my Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, who has supported my work on war literature ever since I arrived at UA, Dean Joe Messina. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Ian and I will be happy to answer some questions if you have some, or to hear your comments. Thank you. By all means, let's do it.
Amy wants me to take